in the same way that it's helpful to set up your bed before you're tired or your kitchen before you're hungry, it can also be really helpful to set up the agreements for how you're going to address conflict before you are in conflict, because that's the hardest time for us to agree about how we're going to handle our conflict. I call it living systems. So it's about looking at how do we handle several different aspects of living or working together ongoingly, and how do we create the conditions to do them that support the ways of doing them that we would like to see. We use like a framework quite loosely of 7 systems. So how do we handle conflict, our conflict system, decision-making system, support and care. How do we make sure that everyone's got the support and care that they need? How do we share resources or distribute resources? How do we listen for and gather and make sense of and use feedback? Connection and community. So how do we build trust and strong relationships and a sense of being on the same team, but also maybe connection to the purpose that we're here to try to fulfill, or why we care about what we're doing, that sort of thing. And also, how do we share information? If people want more information on the living systems, there's a free resource on our website, which is a course that can guide people through working with each of those areas to look at anywhere where any of those things aren't functioning in the way that you'd like, and trying to then evolve or upgrade them. You can't not have a conflict and justice system. You might not think of it as a system, you might not have noticed it or ever talked about it, but you are quite likely to inherit some kind of pattern of how you're going to engage with conflict or make decisions or whatever it is. And if you haven't consciously, collectively chosen the pattern and the system, the shape that you would want, you're quite likely to inherit the dominant ones from our society, which often are competitive and hierarchical and often don't work out so well. I think that in conflict, I want to start by listening to myself. If I'm having a difficult time with you, I want to listen to myself in a way that is making sense of my own experience, empathically, understanding, what is it that I'm feeling, and not trying not to judge that or to notice where I'm judging that, but trying to find a way to listen to myself. And it feels really good in my experience and the experience of many people if I can be like, yeah, that was really frustrating for me, or I felt quite sad when that happened, or I felt really angry when that happened, or whatever it is. And also trying to listen to not only what I've been feeling, but following that down to something that really matters to me within that feeling. So if I'm angry about something, it's because I care about something. If I'm sad about something, it's because I care about something. If I'm scared about something, it's because I care about something. So trying to find out, what is it that I care about? Perhaps all feelings that we experience are giving us a signal of how well our needs are met or not met. So if you're really sad, maybe it's a signal that you need more connection or more support. Another element of support can be for people to reach out to someone, whether that's within the project or quite likely outside of it, who can just really listen and really hear you, who's not going to come in and give loads of suggestions of who's right or who's wrong or anything like that, but just be someone who can hear you and understand what your experience is. Being heard can be a really helpful thing early on in that process. And then once you notice some sort of tension, your first move is to have a direct conversation. Say, you didn't like something that I did, you let me know in an agreed way, hey Paul, I've got a bit of a tension about something that I'd like to work through with you. Can we set up a meeting for us to talk about that? If I'm okay with that, then we can just sit down and do that. Can I understand where you're coming from in a way that doesn't in any way cancel out the impact it's had for me necessarily? Maybe that doesn't quite feel doable, so we slightly increase the level of support. So we get 1 or 2 colleagues that we trust to just come and sit with us in silence. I personally often don't want people who haven't had quite a lot of experience and training to try and actually mediate. It's a difficult thing to do, and a lot of the impulses or scripts people have for how to support people in conflict in this culture don't always bring about the kinds of things that I think would be helpful. And then if those forms of support aren't enough, either because you've tried them and they haven't worked, or you straight away feel this is beyond that level, then I would encourage people to find 1 or 2 mediators that you like and trust the way that they work, who you can call. In the mediation process that I work with, we have some amount of one-to-one conversations with the people involved, and that's for them to be able to just talk about how the situation has affected them and just be heard about it, and also for the mediator to be able to understand what's been going on for that person. And people often find those meetings really, really helpful in themselves. And it's also to explain the process and check a few different things before going into the mediation process and checking if people are really up for going ahead and what support they need, stuff like that. And then it might be that the actual mediation process, the dialogue, could just be, if it's a fairly small thing, it could just be a couple of hours perhaps. And then when agreements are made, which is really important to me in the approach that I use, that it's not just a kind of relational untangling, but it's also looking at really practical agreements to address what has happened and how to set things on a good course going forwards. With that, I try to make sure there's always a review meeting for those agreements. Maybe it happens a month later or a couple of weeks later, depending on the situation, to look at have we managed to follow those agreements and have they worked out for us okay. So that's the broad arc of a mediation process. I've definitely had quite a lot of experiences of people coming to me for mediation and saying, well, we tried mediation. And then when I ask a bit more about that, what they mean is that they had someone who wasn't a trained or experienced mediator. We're training people up for a very extensive, long program of training where they get lots of input and lots of practice and lots of coaching. So I think sometimes people think of what they've experienced as mediation not working. And I would say that's not the same thing as the kind of process that we try to offer that. Or it might be that you've worked with a mediator whose approach doesn't work so well for you, and you could find someone else whose approach would address what wasn't working with the previous mediator. Trying different things that didn't work for quite a long time, and then taking ages to actually get the level of support they needed, and at that point they're exhausted or they've given up, or the level of pain just feels too much for them, or it feels like the only way to care for themselves is to not step into that process. Say, for example, you and me live together in a housing co-op, or we work together in an organisation, and I'm really upset with you and you're really upset with me, but you don't want to go to mediation. It's really tricky to find a way out of that situation, because mediation does need to be voluntary. If you don't actually want to work through things and resolve them, it doesn't work very well for you to go through the motions of the process because you don't see any other option at all. So if there's no way of addressing your concerns about participating in mediation, or we've tried it and it just didn't seem to be working out and you've said, I don't want to do any more, then I think we're moving from collaboration to sort of unilateral or non-collaborative approaches. And I think that it is a really important thing to think about. What do we do if we just cannot agree, or someone is not willing to participate in a particular process or that sort of thing, and trying to have a clear and clean process that's been agreed beforehand. If I've been part of really thinking that through, and then it comes to it's actually me that needs to be the person who's stepping out in that way, there's really no guarantee of it, but there's a possibility that I can see like, yeah, we are in this stuck place. You think this, I think that, you feel this, I feel that. We don't seem to be able to find our way to resolution. So we're going to follow this process that we designed, in which it's going to lead to me being the person who steps out of the organization or something like that, through a recognition that we're stuck and we're out of capacity and we're out of willingness. And if we really care about this project, maybe the most useful thing is for someone to just step out, or both people to step out, and the thing can carry on and survive. I'd also just flag, in so many conflicts, it's that I've done something that's been difficult for you and you've done something that's been difficult for me, not necessarily to equal extents. And I think that's another area where something that is very, very strong in this culture that I think is incredibly unhelpful to conflict going well is the idea of someone being right and someone being wrong, and that can quickly turn into blame and the idea that you're bad, or you thinking that I'm bad or wrong. And I'd hope that we can maybe sort of transform or translate the idea of, if you've done something that's been difficult for me, make that making you bad, but just translating it to you've done something and it's been difficult for me, focusing on the actions and the impacts and not going into the abstraction of therefore you are bad or wrong. We could hear that as a kind of expression of a painfully unmet need, and does understanding it that way help me feel more peace in myself, which doesn't mean that I'm going to tolerate it or not do something about changing it, but it might help me work with you to address the situation.